Welcome back again this year to the SCDM Global Conference. I have the honor and privilege of hosting this year's Regulatory Town Hall with yet again another group of esteemed guests of regulators from around the world. This year, like last year, we're going to cover a lot of really important topics, especially topics that are key and critical to data managers, data scientists all around the world. As we look at our clinical trials today and how they've so quickly evolved, especially over the course of this past year and a half plus at this point, with how clinical trials are, how we're looking at our protocols and flexible study designs. How do we reach patients where they are, engage with them, be able to recruit and retain them, especially. A lot of us in industry are struggling with, what's right, what's acceptable, how do we go about doing these kinds of studies and do so in a compliant way. So again, just like in years past, it's great for me to be able to welcome another great group of individuals here for this regulatory town hall. I'm Jonathan Andrus, Chief Strategy Officer with Clinical Inc., and again, this year's town hall moderator. In addition to this, I also serve on the board of trustees within the Society for Clinical Data Management, and also have the opportunity to interact with folks like who you're going to hear from today on a regular basis. And like in years past, we're joined again this year by Lisbeth from the Danish Medicines Agency, and she's representing the European perspective. Lisbeth this year is going to be talking about some draft guidances on e-systems and e-data, talking about different EU and DKMA initiatives that are ongoing, as well as topics and conversations and meetings around our artificial intelligence and some points to consider on artificial intelligence. Lisbeth is also going to be discussing some guidances on decentralized elements within clinical trials. Jean from the FDA is also joining us here again this year on our town hall. Jean's going to be looking at the evaluation of data reliability and kind of what to expect as a data professional as you carry out your day-to-day work. Lori, joining us this year for the first time, and great to have her here on this esteemed panel. She's going to be talking to us today about the bioresearch monitoring and GCP during COVID-19 and beyond. So certainly some interesting topics that I think, again, all of us in the current status of clinical trials today will be great to hear about. CASA also joining us again this year, representing the Food and Drug Administration. CASA is going to be talking about real-world evidence and decentralized clinical trials. So it'll be an interesting topic of conversation for sure. And then finally, last but not least, Mandy joining us from MHRA in the United Kingdom. And Mandy's going to be talking to us about electronic systems, their role within, from an electronic case report form standpoint. So again, welcome to all of our panelists. Great to have you here again this year. And just like in years past with our regulatory town hall, once our presenters are finished with their presentations, we're going to conclude, but then open up the conversation for those of you joining us here today to ask questions to these panelists based on information you've heard in what they've presented, as well as any other questions that are pressing, that are questions that you have ongoing within your organizations. And we will certainly try to address and get to each of those questions as possible. Of course, as time allows, if they don't have an opportunity to answer every single question that we get, we certainly will be collating those questions after the fact and seeing what we can do to provide some information following this town hall. So again, welcome to my panelists, and our first presenter today is going to be Lisbeth.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. And I'm really happy to be back here at the SCDM conference. A lot of things have happened for the last year, and I'm happy to present a few of them here for you. As Jonathan said, I'm from the Danish Medicines Agency. I'm also part of the GCP Inspectors Working Group under the European Medicines Agency. So some of the points I'm going to make today is both from an EU perspective, but also from a Danish perspective. Let me just start out by just reminding everybody what I was talking about for the last 2 years during the SCDM conferences. So you recognize some of the topics: remote SDV, monitoring, ePro, data clarification processes, etc. And let me just start by saying that these have not been outdated. It's, if anything, it's been clear during the last 1.5 years that these points are still relevant. And I think the first of them, remote SDV, is a brilliant example of a thing that has been accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and where only now we're starting to come back and inspect some of the sites, some of the measures that have been taken, and that clearly demonstrates that there's a need for further guidance, also trying to get post-pandemic. 2019 was very much about computer system validation, audit trail review, long-term archiving, and user management. So very computerized system specific. And so I'm really happy this year to be able to kind of put all that under one umbrella and talk about our EU draft guidance. And those of you who've listened to me for some of the conferences the last 1.5 years will know that every time I say, okay, soon there will be a draft guidance on e-systems and e-data. And I'm really happy to say that this is now upon us. So we have it out for public consultation, and I'll come back to that. I'll also talk a bit about artificial intelligence, because that's another hot topic. I put here EU and DKMA initiatives, but in fact, one of these initiatives is in cooperation with not only FDA, but also with SCDM and eClinical Forum, and I'll come back to that. And as Jonathan said, I'm also going to talk a bit about decentralized elements in clinical trials. And first of all, the EU draft guidance, as I said, it's out for public consultation. It's been that since the 18th of June, and the consultation is open until the 17th of December 2021. So I think this is exactly the audience I want to tell about it, because this is also the audience to whom this guidance is hopefully very applicable, and from whom we would like to have some good feedback on the draft guidance. So this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it. So just to tell you what's actually in the guidance, we have some principles and definition of key things, such as what do we consider data integrity to be, responsibilities, so the responsible parties of investigator and the sponsor, electronic data and source data, ALCOA principles, criticality and risk, which calls for proportionality, are some of them the main key concepts. And then we have a section on computerized systems. A lot of that will be familiar to you from the current reflection paper we have. And then there's a whole section on electronic data. So the data life cycle from data collection and until actually data archiving. And then you'll see that the e-guideline has annexes. So there's an annex 1 about contracts, an annex 2 about computerized system validation, annex 3 about user management, annex 4 about IT security. And then we have Annex 5 also, which is more dwelling into some of the individual types of systems. So here we have some specific requirements regarding eCOA, for instance, some about IRT systems, and some about electronic informed consent. So the whole purpose about making this with annexes is that some of these annexes can be revised more easily than the entire guidance. And also a lot of the things that are in Annex 2, 3, and 4, for instance, are more GXP related than specifically GCP. So maybe a time if we have a better European guidance on GXP data integrity, that can eventually be removed. So there's a shift in categories on an EU level, and maybe my FDA colleagues and Mandy from the MHRA can talk to whether that's overall applicable. But there's a tendency that the more important deviations during inspections are about these things. And it's not a strange thing, because with all the new data types and trial types, it is bound to be more electronically and focused on that. So data management and electronic systems, unblinding and analysis are important points, and often have the tendency to impact reliability of data. And our hope is, of course, that with this guidance, we can prevent some of those. So we very much recommend that your organizations review the guidance carefully and revert with comments by end of this year. As I said, we also have some initiatives regarding artificial intelligence. And one of those initiatives was actually born during an SCDM conference back in 2019, where some of us got together, so SCDM, FDA, and myself, and thought about that we need to start talking about what would be the regulatory requirements and what is happening already in the AI scene in clinical trials. And for that, one of the initiatives we have is the recent AI stakeholder meetings. We had one back in 2020 in September, and now we had another one. And that is a joint initiative by industry, so the SCDM and eClinical Forum, and also regulators, FDA and the EU GCP Inspectors Working Group, who's been in the program committee. We're also currently running qualification advices on artificial intelligence applications, so it is indeed upon us. As you will know, probably, we don't have some really good guidance that is specific to artificial intelligence. In general, they're supposed to be covered by the e-guidance and others, but there is a need for additional guidance. So what we've done in the Danish Medicines Agency is to start drafting some questions and some points to consider regarding critical GXP, artificial intelligence, machine learning applications. And I put in here the link to these questions for which we've invited comments and have received a good number of comments. So hopefully that can eventually develop into a guideline. I also talked about that I wanted to cover guidance on decentralized elements. And that has, of course, been hugely underlined the need for that during the pandemic. And we have some initiatives, not only at the Danish Medicines Agency level, but also on an EU level, where we're trying to put out some more guidance. We have the ongoing measurements for clinical trials during the pandemic, but we want to really look at which of these things can be carried forward and be implemented post-pandemic if we indeed ever reach that state. And for that, I mean, I think one of the most important things is actually to try to pinpoint what are the roadblocks, what are the experience that we already have now, and how can we put that into something useful going forward. So we also realized that it's not really possible to make a finalized guidance at this stage. So what we chose to do in the Danish Medicines Agency is to publish a guideline on where we are now, in fact, and that is giving guidance about the different types of elements that we are currently discussing. And to give us input on that, we've established a dialogue forum with stakeholders. We have industry in there, we have patients and consumers, we have healthcare professionals, we have the Pharmacy Association, we have the Ethics Committee, etc. And we're actually working right now with workshops on some of the more difficult areas in decentralized elements. I put a few here, so telemedicine, remote visits, electronic informed consent, remote monitoring, but there are numerous others, so direct to patient IMP, things like what constitutes an appropriate endpoint for decentralization, and there's a lot of things that we need to get answered here. And also there is a need to talk with data protection agencies about this and the ethics committees about it. And also on an EU level, we have ongoing initiatives regarding some of the same topics, but since EU legislation and guidelines is a little bit more resource difficult, and that many groups have to be taken into account, and 27 different member states legislations, that is obviously a more slow process. So we started up the process, and we are also having currently numerous scientific advices about decentralized trials, both completely decentralized, but also some containing decentralized elements, which more or less all clinical trials are these days. So, and we have ongoing applications actually also. So we're going to look into the experiences that we gained from that. Also, we are looking into the experience gained from the COVID-19 period and the special measurements put in place. And we quite quickly got some feedback from companies and other interested parties. And we are currently more specifically soliciting experience from the investigator sites, both via questionnaires, but also by going out and inspecting them and seeing what their experiences have been. So this is actually what I chose to share with you. I have one other thing, though, that I would like to say and point your interest to, and that is because I'm also in the ICH E6 group, and we are currently reviewing the revision 3 we have now of the E6, so the ICH GCP. And in that context, there has been published principles, actually draft principles. So I can urge you to have a look at that, and maybe especially in this context, the principle number 10, which talks about that the clinical trial should generate reliable results, and it has a lot of sub sections or sub principles, if you will, that talks about the computerized systems, IT security, data system validation, etc. So please go ahead and have a look at that as well. And yeah, I put here for questions. You're welcome to contact me, and also at the end of this session, as Jonathan said. So with that, I'll pass it on to Jean. Thank you.
So thank you, Jonathan, for the invitation to join you all again this year. I'm Jean Melinde. I'm a medical officer and policy advisor in the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation in the Office of Scientific Investigations at FDA's Center for Drugs. So today I'll kick off the FDA's topics with a discussion about how we, more specifically CDER, evaluate data reliability with a focus on topics that I think will be of particular interest to this group. So here is our standard FDA disclaimer. You can read this yourself. And just as a reminder, the discussions we've had over the past several years. So in 2019, I talked to you about the need to ensure that data management professionals are fully involved in the quality of design process, to ensure that the balance of stakeholders on study teams fully appreciate your perspectives on risks to clinical trial data and related management strategies. Then last year, with the event of the COVID-19 pandemic, we spent some time discussing guidance that had been issued by the FDA related to continuing operations and the important role of good risk assessment and management in the face of the pandemic and the related challenges. And Lori is going to provide further FDA updates on this topic shortly. So I want to return this year to talk about, now that your study is approaching completion, has recently completed, or even been submitted, what you as a data professional, be it within your firm's data management or statistical groups, may want to be aware of when it comes to CDER's evaluation of data reliability. In doing this, I'll touch briefly on guidance issued by CDER, a tool used by CDER for clinical investigator site selection, and areas of focus in sponsor and CRO inspections that I think are particularly relevant to this group. Some of you are likely already aware that CDER issued guidance in 2018, along with associated BIMO data conformance specifications that were updated again in 2020, that described NDA and BLA contents needed for planning and conduct of BIMO inspections. which include clinical investigator and sponsor CRO inspections. I'm not going to go through the contents of these documents in any depth today due to time constraints, but the links to the documents are available on the slide. One related item that I wanted to bring to your attention, though, is work that a group of your colleagues have undertaken through FUSE, being referred to as the FUSE Biomonitoring Project. The working group is composed of more than 30 industry stakeholders, as well as members of CDER and CBER. And I listed the group's co-leads here, Julie Maynard, Jonas Polson, and Sopan Kaith, as well as our FUSE support liaison, Paula Rowley, should any of you want to inquire further about this effort. The first remit of this group has been to develop a BIMO data review guide template and associated completion guidelines. And these were just recently presented for discussion earlier this month at FUSE's Computational Science Symposium. And the group is anticipating publishing these documents for comment prior to the year's end. Next up, a brief mention about the tool that CDER primarily uses to identify clinical investigator sites for inspection for pending applications. The clinical investigator site selection tool serves as a risk-ranked framework for site selection that provides standard data exploration methods for our reviewers. It assembles many site characteristics in one place very early in the review clock and permits the reviewers to choose sites based on views such as data irregularities, outlier and inlier analyses, their inspectional histories, and clinical investigator participation across studies, as well as providing regional and country-specific data views and automated process documentation and form generation functions. Having touched briefly on clinical investigator inspection planning, I'll turn now in more detail to sponsor and CRO inspections. So to start with, a bit of a primer on what our reviewers are considering in the determination of whether they will request a sponsor and or CRO inspection. Sponsor CRO inspections are most likely to be requested for an original NDA or BLA submission, or for supplements requesting new indications. Additional items that will factor into reviewers' decision-making process will be whether the studies supporting the application include novel trial designs, or utilize novel technologies, the prior inspectional history of the sponsor or the CRO, and whether the reviewers, that is, have identified any data inconsistencies, anomalies, or unexpected outcomes in their reviews. And findings on related clinical investigator inspections are also very important. In particular, any findings that suggest there may be a systemic issue going on in the study. So if your firm has been notified of an inspection, the inspection will be led and conducted by an Office of Regulatory Affairs investigator who may or may not also be accompanied by a center subject matter expert. And please understand that the goal of this inspection is really just to understand and evaluate how the study was planned, conducted, and reported. While I know some firms want to have only upper-level management respond to investigator queries and questions, based on my experience during inspections, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have the actual boots on the ground individuals who are most knowledgeable about how the specific study was operationalized and conducted available to respond to those questions. And when it comes to specific inspectional topics that I think this group may be most likely to be called on to provide information for, I've listed a number here and on the next slide. Of course, this will vary between firms. If you have participated, for example, in decisions about selection of vendors and services, this is an area for which you might be asked for input. In addition, though an investigator isn't going to ask this group about how monitors are selected, they may well ask about involvement in risk assessment and planning for monitoring, and certainly about centralized monitoring activities in which you've been involved. In relation to safety oversight, I think any inspectional issues you might encounter would pretty much be limited to the safety database in use. For data collection and handling items, though, I would expect you all to be much more heavily contributing information during the inspection. Similarly, for issues related to electronic records and signatures, I would anticipate the folks here today will be among those having the most knowledge about the systems the firm is using and be active participants during the inspection. And because issues of record custody and retention really go hand in hand with development and management of electronic systems, that you may have a role in this area as well. So I'm going to wrap up my talk here and turn it over to Lori to continue for FDA. And I look forward to your questions and discussion shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean, and thank you, Jonathan, for having me here today. Again, my name is Laurie Muldowney, and I am with the Office of Scientific Investigations within the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I'm going to be giving a pretty high-level overview today, focusing on the impacts of COVID-19, both on the conduct of clinical trials as well as on bioresearch monitoring, and what this might mean looking forward. And this is the standard FDA disclaimer as well. So it goes without saying, but COVID has had a significant impact on every aspect of our lives. From a clinical trial conduct perspective, absenteeism, site closures, supply chain interruptions have all created challenges in the conduct of clinical trials. And this has led to difficulties in meeting protocol-mandated visits, as well as routine distribution and administration of investigational products, to name a few. From a bioresearch monitoring perspective, travel restrictions, as well as concerns about the safety of ORA investigators and site staff and patients, have significantly limited our abilities to conduct on-site inspections over the last year and a half. And there really continues to be a lot of uncertainty in that area. So from the beginning of the public health emergency, FDA's stated goals were really focused on supporting our public health mission. And this includes facilitating efforts to diagnose, treat, and prevent disease, monitoring medical supply chain to try to prevent and mitigate drug shortages, and using every tool at our disposal to continue to oversee the safety and quality of FDA-regulated products. So what this has really meant from the very beginning, the FDA has issued a number of guidances focused on the development of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for COVID. We're collaborating with our public health partners and with international counterparts. And we've increased our communication with industry. An example of this would be the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, or CTAP, which is an emergency program that was really set up to accelerate the development and the access to coronavirus therapies while ensuring that those therapies are safe and effective. So it really has been an all-hands-on-deck approach at the FDA. At last count, FDA had released close to 80 guidance documents under the temporary authority of the public health emergency. FDA also developed a coronavirus landing page where you can find links to all of the guidances related to coronavirus. And you can also find information for industry as well as for healthcare professionals, frequently asked questions, information on emergency use authorizations are just a few examples of what you would find on that landing page. The key GCP guidance issued during the pandemic is on the conduct of clinical trials during the public health emergency. And this guidance was initially issued in March of 2020, but there have been, I think, 4 or 5 updates to the guidance since that time, addressing frequently asked questions from the public and from industry. The most recent update, I believe, was in August of this year. And the guidance provides general considerations to assist in assuring the safety of clinical trial participants, maintaining compliance with GCP, and ensuring or minimizing risks to trial integrity during the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the guidance provides recommendations on the delivery and administration of investigational products, approaches to remote informed consent, and recommendations regarding remote clinical outcomes assessments are just a few examples. There's a recognition that there will be missing data and that there will be protocol deviations, but that it's necessary that these are documented clearly and completely. So really, documentation is key, and that is highlighted throughout the guidance. Finally, there's recommendations to optimize the use of central and remote monitoring to maintain oversight of clinical sites. Really, at the end of the day, clinical sites are expected to work in the best interest of their patients, and what that means is going to be unique to the site. However, study activities will need to be supported by quality documentation that still allow for the reconstruction of the trial. So again, FDA's ability to conduct on-site inspections over the last year and a half has been significantly impacted. However, we've continued to conduct certain mission-critical inspections on-site on a case-by-case basis. FDA has also used a COVID-19 advisory rating system to determine if other inspections not considered to be mission critical may be conducted in a given geographic region. And what this really is it's sort of an interactive map that uses COVID metrics, cases, hospitalizations, and deaths to color code geographic regions in a green, yellow, or red way. And if an area is color coded as green, for example, and if there's an investigator who is in that area, then they may be able to conduct an on-site inspection, even if that inspection is not considered to be mission critical. In addition to continuing to conduct some on-site inspections, other pathways have been used to inform decisions regarding pending applications. And this, of course, includes information sharing with our foreign regulatory counterparts. And it also includes some additional approaches, such as remote interactive evaluations that I'll touch on in just a minute. Postponed inspections continue to be prioritized for completion when travel restrictions are lifted. And I should mention that as of July 1st, domestic inspections shifted back to normal operations. But I thought that this slide was still really relevant to include here. One, because it shows that the approach that we have been taking throughout the public health emergency. Also because foreign inspections are still significantly limited. And finally, nobody has a crystal ball, but I think there's always the potential that there may be travel restrictions again in the future, whether that's related to COVID variants or something else, that I think it's important to kind of consider these approaches. I mentioned remote interactive evaluations, and that's what we're calling our voluntary assessments that have been conducted throughout the public health emergency. We issued a guidance in April of 2021 that sort of covers some of the basics of an RIE. But basically, an RIE is going to include review of documents and records, typically either through a cloud-based platform to share those documents, through screen sharing, or through direct read-only access to electronic systems. RIEs may also include the use of live stream or pre-recorded video, and you can imagine this is particularly important for manufacturing inspections where we're actually inspecting an ongoing process. Also may be important for analytical bioequivalency studies and for other types of inspections as well. And teleconferences, as well as video conferences and interviews and meetings to address questions and concerns throughout the course of the RIE are really critical to the success of the RIE. There's been challenges and successes associated with RIEs, and it's certainly not a perfect substitute for an on-site inspection. I would say there have been some unique challenges in the GCP world, and in particular for clinical investigator remote interactive evaluations. Some of these challenges have been related to patient confidentiality issues, in particular outside of the United States, where there's been a need to significantly redact information. This can sometimes be burdensome to the site, and it can also limit the information that is available for review from our ORA investigators. So again, it's certainly not a perfect substitute. There may always be a little bit lost with that by not having that face-to-face interaction in person. However, it continues to be a learning process, and we continue to really learn and evolve on our RIEs. Somewhat related, and I think particularly relevant to this group, was that there was an update to the 2021 Investigations Operations Manual that allows ORA investigators to request read-only access to electronic systems during a BIMO inspection. This is really recognizing the move towards the increased use of EDC as well as other electronic systems, and recognizing that the traditional sort of over-the-shoulder approach to looking at screens may not always be feasible and practical. And I will mention that the use of this read-only access can be used either for a remote interactive evaluation or for an on-site inspection. So where do we go from here? In May of 2021, FDA published a resiliency roadmap that provided an overview of some of the inspectional activities during the course of the pandemic and also the approach for moving forward. At that time, there had been approximately 400 on-site BIMO inspections during the public health emergency, as well as 70 remote regulatory assessments. And I will clarify, remote regulatory assessments is sort of the umbrella term. Remote interactive evaluations falls under that term. In BIMO, we kind of use those terms interchangeably, but in May, we'd had about 70 RIEs since the start of the public health emergency. And of course, the numbers of both those on-site inspections and alternative approaches have increased since that time. We also have had numerous information sharing engagements, again, with our foreign regulatory counterparts, and that really continues. And, we're continuing to use a risk-based approach to scheduling inspections and determining the most appropriate pathway to evaluate data integrity. So looking forward, over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the adoption of alternative approaches as well as advanced technologies by industry in response to the challenges associated with COVID-19. We've seen the adoption of remote consent processes as well as increased use of electronic data capture. Alternative approaches, including remote patient-reported outcomes and virtual visits, as well as home delivery of investigational products, have been used as a result of the pandemic. And we've also seen an increased use in the use of risk-based monitoring. And this is something that the FDA has been encouraging for some time now. And it's really, again, moving away from 100% source data verification, focusing on important and likely risks, and utilizing remote and central monitoring approaches. Again, these are practices that were used prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic may have accelerated their adoption. So the FDA is really looking forward as well. I mentioned a number of guidances that were published during the public health emergency, and these guidances were specifically issued for the duration of the pandemic, but many of the lessons can be carried forward. The most recent CEDAR guidance agenda was posted in July of 2021, and it gives you a sense of FDA's direction, as well as FDA's recognition of the modernization of clinical trial design and conduct and what that might mean for us. So many of these topics have already been touched on and will be touched on by my colleagues today. But as you can see, there are plans for guidances on decentralized clinical trials, the use of digital health technologies, electronic systems, and real-world data and real-world evidence, just to name a few. In terms of GCP oversight, as I mentioned, as of July 1st, FDA returned to normal inspection operations for domestic inspections. However, I think there's still significant limitations for foreign inspections. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that, there is a lot of uncertainty moving forward regarding whether there might be a need for further restrictions in the future. So with that in mind, we're continuing to explore alternative approaches, including our remote interactive evaluations or remote regulatory assessments. We're expanding the use of technologies and modifying our approaches to become more efficient and effective at remote evaluations. And this includes the use of read-only access to electronic systems. And we have relied on, and we continue to rely on, our international partners and see significant value in our data sharing agreements. So in summary, FDA will continue to maximize the use of every available approach and resource to meet our regulatory responsibilities and to achieve our optimal public health outcomes, both during the public health emergency and beyond. So with that, I will turn it over to Casa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lori, and thank you very much, SCDM, for inviting us to participate in the regulatory panel again this year. My name is Casa Ayaleo. I am from Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation within Office of Scientific Investigation and in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. As Jonathan has made a remark during the introduction, I'll be talking today on real-world evidence and decentralized clinical trials from GCP perspective. This is the FDA's disclaimer, and the view and the opinions presented here are mine. They are not FDA's. As stated, I will be providing you some background on the use of decentralized clinical trials and data that come from real-world setting, and discuss FDA's regulatory expectations as well as requirement. To give you some background, as most of you know, FDA supports clinical trials that are more agile and efficient, that are able to reduce administrative and patient burden without compromising the quality of the data and the integrity of the clinical trial. FDA evaluates data obtained from non-traditional clinical studies such as real-world settings and clinical trials model like DCT to help support the approval of medical products and to help support or satisfy post-approval study requirements. Also, there is a growing interest in recent years, in particular during the last couple of years because of COVID-19 pandemic, for patient-centric drug development and the use of data that come from real-world settings or data obtained through clinical trials models such as DCT. Clinical trial designs have been incorporating some remote study data collection methods such as the use of ePro or a handheld device in traditional clinical trial settings for long period of time. Likewise, there has been an increase use of data obtained from real-world settings to support regulatory approval decisions of medical products in rare disease and in indications such as for unmet medical needs. What are the basis for the use of data that come from DCT and real-world settings? Clearly, the advance in technology as a result of increase in the use of computerized and digital system to capture data more efficiently have expanded the type of clinical trial related activities that can be performed without having participants come to clinical investigator sites. Of course, the patients need to have better access to clinical trials and to have convenience and comfort by having clinical trials come to them or near to them in healthcare facilities such as local clinical healthcare providers plays a major role. Having a DCT kind of model has a potential to enable the remote participation of subjects in clinical trials and to reduce the patients' need to travel to have a face-to-face meeting. Sometimes some patients have to travel far away to reach to clinical investigators. By doing that, it may also enhance convenience and may encourage patients to participate in clinical trials. The public health needs has a significant role as basis to use new models and patients requiring new approach in order to have better, effective, and safe products. The same way the industry needs to enable recruiting participants within a short period of time and increase diversity of population participating in clinical studies, as well as to reduce cost, plays a significant role. Last but not least, regulators also want to advance the clinical trial the drug development by having new models that are efficient and effective. let us look into a potential advantage of using DCT and data that come from real-world evidence or settings. The potential advantage of data generated or obtained from sources other than traditional clinical trials, such as real-world studies or interventional studies and models such as DCT, include increase in trial efficiency and reduction of costs of conducting clinical trials, and reduction of patient burdens by providing convenience, comfort, and helping to address questions in cases where studies cannot be conducted for ethical reasons, in particular in real-world studies. And the other advantage is to have better data processing and reduction of costs if they are done properly, in particular when sponsors use computerized system and digital tools to directly collect data from the source. Laurie has touched upon some of the guidance that are in the pipeline, and to help the use of data that come from real-world setting and conducting DCT, FDA has published several guidances. Here, I have a few of them. The guidance on use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical device by CDRH got published in 2017. And a year later, in 2008, the framework for FDA real-world evidence program and the guidance about the use of electronic health records in clinical investigations were published. In 2019, the draft guidance about submitting documents utilizing real-world data and evidence to FDA for drugs and biologics was published. More guidances, as Laurie stated earlier, are also expected to come out soon further, and they would add better understanding for the use of real-world evidence and DCT. And I will be mentioning about some of them before the end of my talk. How should we determine the appropriateness of real-world evidence or decentralized clinical trials? Determining the appropriateness of real-world evidence or DCTs for FDA submission need consideration of several factors. Example of factors that need to be considered include the nature of the disease and study population. And therefore, sponsors should engage with regulators in the early stage of designing of their clinical trials. Sponsors are encouraged to request a meeting with the appropriate review division within the agency if they wish to use clinical studies such as real-world non-interventional studies or models such as DCT. Additional considerations include the suitability of the study endpoints for remote data collection and the remote assessment, and the suitability of the IP, the investigational product, and other treatment used in trials, as these are often shipped directly to the patients. Direct shipment to study participants will depend on the risk of the investigational product or the condition that patients may have and the study of interest, the logistics as well as local legislations. Decision related to whether a trial model should be decentralized or to use non-interventional studies for regulatory decision-making should be driven by factors such as the nature of the disease, the design of the trial, the geography and the infrastructure, and availability of technology and the ability to use technology such as DHT and electronic platforms, and endpoint appropriateness, whether that could be collected or captured remotely or not in DCT, and trial procedures that would be critical for conducting the clinical studies, and the investigational product, as stated earlier, the storage and the administration registration of the investigational product, whether that would be done by local healthcare provider or delegated individuals to conduct DCT kind of trials, and availability of local healthcare services, and also compliance with the state and regional law as the telehealth or assessment of patients in the clinical trials requires to meet the local and state regulations, including also the IP shipment to the patients. What are the challenges associated in conducting DCT and studies that use real-world data and real-world evidence? While the goal of DCT, one of the goals is to facilitate individual participation in clinical research, DCT may also lead to some challenges in retaining trial participants in the absence of in-person visit, and as some patients may benefit or require a sustained relationship with the trial personnel that may not be available in the models such as DCT. In addition, the risk of missing data may arise from failure to have a proper oversight to healthcare providers, and that needs to be taken into account when one decides to use the DCT model. As stated before, many state boards in the US require that physicians engaging in doing telemedicine are licensed in the state where they practice, or where they provide patient care. Therefore, it is very important to look into jurisdictional laws governing telehealth, as well as jurisdictional requirement about shipping investigational medical products directly to the patients. In addition, an arrangement may be needed, in particular to have a local healthcare providers that will be delegated to do some of the tasks, providing service, who are to ensure the appropriate DCT operation. Special planning is needed for DCT investigators to oversee DCT personnel working remotely. For real-world evidence or non-interventional studies generating data for regulatory purpose, it is very important to have a well-designed and fit-for-purpose, which means reliable and relevant study that will be able to generate data that can be compared to a suitable control in order to be considered adequate and well controlled. The study design should be able to provide adequate and scientific evidence, and the conduct of the study would need to meet regulatory requirements, including GCP expectations. Let's look into regulatory expectation and requirements. And DCT are subject to the same regulatory requirements as other FDA-regulated clinical trials, such as non-traditional clinical studies. And in general, FDA's expectation remain the same when it comes to sponsors and clinical investigator responsibilities. Regardless of the type of studies, whether it's real-world evidence or a DCT kind of model, the responsibility of investigators and sponsors do not change. The evidence submitted, in addition, the most importantly, the evidence submitted by a sponsor in marketing application to support the safety and effectiveness of the drug must also satisfy the legal and standards necessary for drug licensing. The product, and here are some products and indications that are the result of the use of data that come from real-world evidence. The FDA has used real-world data to support a number of approval decisions in rare diseases and areas of high unmet medical needs. the approval of the listed products here, the most recent one, the Prograph for prevention of lung transplant rejection, and the several products that you see in the slide demonstrate that non-interventional study have the potential to meet FDA's regulatory expectations. As research methods and technologies continue to evolve, the real-world data and the quality that comes from real-world evidence and the methods of analysis are expected to improve, and the real-world evidence and real-world data may play an increasing role in FDA's regulatory decisions. Earlier, I stated some of the guidances that have come out to support some of the activities to conduct non-interventional studies, in particular real-world kind of studies. And here I have listed some of the guidance that are in the making to support activities such as conducting decentralized clinical trials. Currently, the ICH E6, as Elizabeth stated and also mentioned by Lori, guideline for good clinical practice, and the E8, the ICH E8, general consideration for clinical studies, are going through a revision. And the ICH E6 is expected to have topics on DCT, and will be addressing some of the expectation and requirements, in particular in Annex 2. Which will be covering non-traditional interventional trials, including as well as DCT. In addition, there would be a new and revised CEDAR draft guidances document planned for publication, which are in the pipeline. And as was mentioned during Laurie's talk, there are draft guidances in the making and for decentralized clinical trials, the use of digital technologies, for remote data acquisition in clinical investigation, the use of electronic records, signature in clinical investigation under Part 11. This is a follow-up from the guidance in 2017. And the consideration for use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making, as well as other guidances. And I have placed a link at the bottom to help you and to look into the list of guidances that are in the making. The takeaways from my presentation, really, I want to emphasize that real-world evidence and DCT make a valuable contribution in the drug development. And regardless of the approach that sponsors may choose to generate data for regulatory submission, the investigator and the sponsor responsibility do not change. The sponsors who intend to use data from non-interventional clinical studies or generate data using a DCT model to support regulatory submission should consider to have an early discussion with the appropriate review division within CEDAR to get feedback on consideration of that particular model. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward for your questions and comments afterwards. And now I will turn it to Mandy for the next presentation.
Thank you, Katha, and thank you for the introduction, Jonathan, and good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be presenting at the SCDM Regulatory Town Hall again, so thank you for inviting me back. Today I'll be discussing the data integrity topic in relation to e-systems design and use, where we are increasingly seeing non-compliance on inspection. Just a brief overview of the agenda. We'll go back to basics with this presentation and just go through the definition of a CRF according to ICH GCP, talk about how CRFs have evolved and different functionalities of e-systems, look at their data flows, the exciting part, look at some example findings, and touch on changes to investigator data as well. So I'm sure many of you watching this presentation are facing similar setups as the one in this image, highlighting the increasing use of electronic ways of working. This trend is also increasing in clinical trials, as mentioned throughout this regulatory town hall, with the evolution of trials to obtain data more efficiently whilst remaining accessible to all users at all times. Now, my colleagues and I in the GCP Inspectorate here at the MHRA have noticed that not all e-systems have been designed with the correct functionality in mind, despite being a medium to collect and report protocol required clinical data to the sponsor or its delegated representative. Often the functionality of these systems have not considered the same functionality for ECRFs, and in this presentation I will explore this issue further and provide examples of our findings. Okay, so let's start with reminding ourselves of what the definition of a CRF is. So according to ICH-GCP, it's a printed, optical or electronic document designed to record all of the protocol required information to be reported to the sponsor on each trial subject. The UK Clinical Trials Regulations also has requirements for data integrity and the ability to reconstruct the data audit trail. Therefore, we have established that the CRF is a mechanism to report protocol required information to the sponsor, and there must be provisions in place to ensure the accuracy, the robustness, and maintain confidentiality throughout. Now, the ECRF is an electronic form of data capture, which we know, to report data to the sponsor, and many other systems are also capturing data to report to the sponsor in the same way, and are often the only source of this protocol required data point, or can sometimes be a duplication. So I like to take it back to basics, as I mentioned, and this is what I will do with this presentation. Now, we're all aware of the evolution from paper-based CRFs and double data entry into the CRF was well known. The data was previously collected in these paper CRFs, which the site would complete. The monitor would come along and take the NCL copies of the CRF, leaving an original copy behind for the investigator. Now, these copies were sent to data management for data entry into the clinical database, and the ECRF came along to act as a front end of collecting this information. And the data could then be directly entered into the database. Data can be entered into the clinical database in a number of ways, not just using the front end of the ECRF. We can have data also sent directly through data transfer, such as from the central laboratory data or from the IRT system as well. There can be data tables which are within the clinical database which are not viewable via the CRF front end, and so that database would just be transferred to the database. Or sometimes what we see is that there are forms within the CRF field, and some of this integrated data can be visible in the CRF, or sometimes can be editable as well, and I'll explore each of these scenarios. And here I give you the example with this line going from the investigator side of entering data directly into the IRT system. And also you have other wearables, eCOA, ePro, all collecting data and then transferring it to the clinical database. Okay, so in this first scenario, I'll explore the data flow of when the protocol required data, let's say such as dosing information, is entered directly into IRT and not in the ECRF. The data from IRT is then integrated into the clinical database tables, but is not viewable within the ECRF front end. The data from IRT is then integrated into the clinical database tables, as I've mentioned. And in this example, the IRT system then is acting as an ECRF, as it is collecting the protocol required data, which was subsequently analysed and reported in the CSR. There have been a number of findings with this setup seen on inspection, including a lack of controls to ensure the integrity and the robustness of data entered. So some of these example findings include, now the IRT system had not been validated as an ECRF. It hadn't even been considered within the build, and therefore was not compliant with ICH-GCP. And one of these consequences was there was a lack of an adequate audit trail. A common finding is the reason for change is not included. So you can see what data has changed, but you can't see why. An IRT database is, we've seen being held by the sponsor. And this is particularly important because with an ECRF, it shouldn't be held in the sole control of the sponsor. Quite often it's delegated to a third party. So what this means is the investigator no longer has control of their CRF data. And this is also an issue we've seen with ePro and eCOA previously as well. We've seen no sign-off of data by the investigator of the IRT data, and there's no similar lock processes. So the systems and processes for database lock for the ECRF are not replicated with other systems collecting clinical data, such as the IRT system in this example. No edit or query process within the system, or a lack of reconciliation of data clarification forms. The same data management processes for the ECRF are often not replicated and can lead to gaps in the audit trail when reviewing the data against the source. And also, how does the investigator get a copy of their data? And we've seen that investigators are not provided with a copy of the IRT data or the metadata at the end of the trial. This is a GCP requirement, and the investigator should maintain access to their data at all times, especially if the system contains source data. We've seen examples of no monitoring of the data where source existed and where no source existed. The protocol did not state that the source data would be directly entered into the e-system. So something to think about is your system collecting source data? Are you aware of this? And where is this defined? And how is this risk assessed and managed to ensure data integrity and that the investigator has control and continuous access to their source data? We've seen a lack of adequate archiving of the data and the system as well. So can the system be restored with the data within it to view all the data points and workflows which may not be archived in the data set? And quite often we've seen differences within the data sets that are archived. Okay, so in this next scenario, I will explore when clinical data is entered into an e-system and then integrated into a clinical database, but it is visible in a form field within the ECRF, but it can't be edited. So let's use the IRT system again. So we can look at age or date of birth being entered into the system by the site user for stratification or randomization purposes. This data is then transferred to the clinical database and is now appearing on the ECRF page for the site user to see, but it can't be edited so they can view it. In this scenario, the IRT system is still acting as a CRF, and the same principles as discussed in the previous scenario apply. However, we have also seen the same scenario occur where the ECRF form field is editable and then is amended, for example, following a monitoring query, which can then result in discrepancies within the two data sets. So consideration should be given to the monitoring and data reconciliation processes and how the accuracy of the data used for the CSR is ensured. If there are any randomization or stratification errors as a result of discrepant data, how are these managed in terms of patient safety and the accuracy of the data reported in the CSR? Okay, so in this example, we will explore the same data point being entered into the IRT system and into the ECRF at the same time. So for example, the site enters weight for dosing into the IRT system, which is then transferred to the clinical database tables and is not visible within the ECRF. However, the ECRF also contains a field to enter weight at various visits, and this is then transferred to the clinical database. There are a number of things to consider with this scenario, and there are things to think about if you recognize any of these processes within your systems. So things to think about would include which dataset will be used for the analysis, and where is this defined, and how is the data in the two systems reconciled, and how are discrepancies managed? Is this a critical data point? If so, how is this monitored, and is it included in any risk-based monitoring processes that you may have? And is the data used for a dosing calculation? So as mentioned previously, what's the impact of any incorrect data entry, and how is this managed? The reason I mention this is we have seen on occasions where the data that had been entered into the IRT system hadn't been monitored, but only the data that had been entered into the ECRF system. So then there were discrepancies between the two systems. And where the data had been changed in the ECRF, the impact of this had not been noted. Now, these same principles would apply to other e-systems which obtain clinical data and report it to the sponsor, such as ECOA as well. I'll talk through some inspection findings we have observed. Due to limited time, I'm briefly going to go through these, but I won't be able to talk through them as case studies in detail. So let's go through some of these. During one inspection, the inspector noticed that the ECRF hardly contained any protocol required data, and instead, most of the clinical data, such as vital signs, was contained within the ECOA system. The ECOA system did not have the required functionality of the ECRF, and the audit trail did not show a reason for change. Now, be aware if your e-system contains source data, as this should be defined in the protocol and risk assessed to ensure its integrity, accuracy, robustness, confidentiality as well. And the investigator should have continuous access and control during and at the end of the study. Maintenance of source records is an investigator responsibility, and so if the e-system will be replacing this, then how has this been delegated by the PI formally? An example of this is having seen drug accountability records only being included in the IoT system, and the sponsor telling sites that they didn't need to maintain separate records. So therefore, the e-system itself contained source data. We've also seen stratification errors due to incorrect data entry, as I've mentioned previously, but not all of these have been transparently described in the clinical study report or reflected in the analysis. So for this particular licensing application, the indication was modified for the license based on the data from a particular strata. However, there were a number of errors which had not been reflected in the analysis. So an impact assessment and analysis was required. So this links back to your protocol deviation process, recording, collection, and reporting of these as well. So now we'll look at changes to investigators' data. Now, changes to the investigators' data is strongly discouraged. All data changes require approval by the investigator, and CRF completion is an investigator responsibility and requires formal delegation of this task. The risk here is that the sponsor staff have edit rights to the CRF and the ability to change other data. So what checks are performed to ensure that no other data is changed and that the investigator has formally delegated this task, as well as having clear oversight of all entries or changes. Going back to basics, with a paper CRF, the investigator always retained their independent copy on site, and any changes were requested via DCF. These are then available as an audit trail between the eCRF and the data entered into the clinical database. And the same considerations need to apply for all e-systems which contain protocol-required data, such as ePro and eCOA as well. There should be a mechanism in place for the investigator to change their data. We have seen on inspections queries for ePro being sent by the CRA and never being seen or approved by the investigator prior to changes being made to the data. And that's not acceptable. In summary, it's not necessary for sponsors to have edit access to the eCRF. Instead, the system design should be taken into consideration to determine if a separate database or change functionality of the system to include the information either as a separate front end, separate from the eCRF, or as a separate workflow would be better suited rather than entering the data into actual CRF fields. And with the evolution of the eCRF as well, we're seeing them evolve further into almost a clinical trial management system, as well as a safety database. And I'll give you some examples here of where we have seen this happen, and then the eCRF being written into by sponsor staff. And one example is for electronic serious adverse event reporting, and we're seeing an increasing use of this via the eCRF, which has had many efficiencies as a result. However, we're seeing sponsor staff write in the CRF the SAE receipt date and their company causality assessment, and that's not appropriate. And we've also seen protocol deviations entered into a form on the eCRF. Maybe in this scenario, either entering them within the workflow or as a separate front end would be more appropriate to the clinical database. Okay, so to summarize, we're seeing an increased use of e-systems within clinical trials, as you've heard throughout this town hall. The functionality of the eCRF and ICH GCP requirements have not been considered when building IoT, ePro, eCOA systems collating protocol required data. What you can do after this presentation, if you recognise some of these within your systems, is map out the different systems used within your trials and the data flow between them. Identify locations of source data and transcribed data within the flow and what data integrity control measures are in place. And remember that systems should permit data changes by the investigator with a clear audit trail of the change, including the reason. After all, the data belongs to them. The impact of any incorrect data entry on patient safety and data integrity should be considered as part of the risk assessment for the trial when building the e-system. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. If you'd like to know more about this topic, we have written a blog post, which the links to are on here, as well as the MHRA GXP data integrity guidance. Okay, thank you all, and I'll hand back to Jonathan now for the Q&A panel.